Now that you're starting to get a pretty good grasp on what XAML is and how to use it when creating UIs for your applications, let's start to take that knowledge and dig a little bit deeper. Now, you could continue to just create simple UIs by dragging and dropping some components or some UI elements onto your design surface, or editing the XAML file directly and then ultimately getting all this stuff on the UI. And then what? So you want to have your application actually be able to serve a purpose or to have something about it that entices the user to use it. After all, that's why you create these apps, in order to get them out into the world and get them into people's hands. So without some good functionality, an application is only going to sit there and be a UI and have nothing very interesting to it. So the way that we start to add functionality and to give life to an application or to the user interface within Windows Phone is to start down the path of using the MVVM pattern, or the model view view model pattern. So over the next couple of lessons, I'm going to walk you through the process of describing MVVM by building out a simple UI for a very basic application that will ultimately show you the basics of, say, an invoice that will be presented to the user, and then you can take a look at it and maybe modify the amount of that invoice, see if it's paid or not, and then ultimately pay that invoice if it is not already done and taken care of. So we're going to start at the very beginning of the MVVM pattern, which is the first M, which is model. So what is a model? A model is basically a representation of the data that your application is working with. So let's say you have some sort of data set that either lives within a database or within a web service somewhere, and your application goes and gets that data from somewhere. That data that lives maybe in that database is probably what you would consider the model of your view. Now, your model is typically in charge of handling things like validation to make sure everything within that model is correct, and any sort of basic business logic around that model. So maybe business rules that apply to that particular model or the properties within that model is all the realm and domain that should be handled within that class or series of classes. So let's go ahead and start by building a very simple model. So I'm going to start by doing some basic organization that I like to do within my applications, whether it's mobile applications or really any other type of applications for that matter, is I like to build out some folder structure here. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a new folder, and I'm going to name this models. Now within models, I'm going to create my first model class, and my model class is going to be a simple C# class, and we'll call this invoice. So here's a basic class. Now the cool thing about the MVVM pattern is there is a little bit of flexibility, but it's a very simple process. You really have just a few components, a few pieces that work together and ultimately create this rich user experience. So let's say we have a few properties on this particular invoice. So what we want to be able to do here is we want to have the amount that this invoice is for, so we're going to start by creating a property, and it's going to be a decimal, and this is going to be the amount. It's going to be the value that's associated with this particular invoice, so maybe it's $5 or $2 or something along those lines. So now we're also going to have some sort of flag in there to designate whether or not this particular invoice has been paid. So we'll create another property, and we'll just have this be a Boolean, and then we'll just call this is paid. And this will be a getter and a setter on this one as well. And then we also want to be able to have the functionality to be able to pay this, and there's going to be some business logic around that. So the way that we're going to handle this is by having a method here, a public method that's going to be a void, and it's simply going to be called pay. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to wrap some business logic within this model class to say it's going to know how to get paid, and someone can issue a pay request to actually be able to pay this. And what that means doesn't really matter, other than the fact that it's probably going to be something along the lines of setting is paid equal to true. So we'll kind of start with that kind of a thought when it comes to our invoice. So the first thing we want to do when we actually create a new instance of this invoice is we're going to assume that it's not going to be paid yet. So we'll go ahead and create a constructor for this. So we'll say invoice, and then we'll set the is paid equal to false. So when we first create this invoice, we're going to set the amount, and we can either set that by passing a value into our constructor or setting it with some object initialization. Really, either way, it doesn't really matter, but we want to make sure that our invoice is not paid to begin with. And actually, maybe even a better way to think of that is to actually make this is paid private. So the only way that we can actually do that is from within this class itself. And so you actually have to call pay in order to actually get this thing paid. So here's a very simple invoice class that has an amount, whether or not it's paid, and a method in order to actually pay this invoice. So this is what we want to ultimately be our model class that's going to represent some data within our application, and then we're going to want to be able to put that up on the screen somehow to actually show the user what that is. So now that we have our model, we have the M of the MVVM, we're going to step over into the V, which is the view, and in the next lesson we're going to create a very simple view that we want to present to the user.